And as soon as he looked across the way, he saw all the problems he had with Lincoln melt away. Not that he was in awe of him. He said there was something pure about him. And one of the things, if I could paraphrase, he says, I realized I was looking at a man that truly embodied the phrase, Honest Abe. And they sit there and talk, but not platitudes. They talk in substance. And he says, listen, you got your black fighters, but you're not paying them the same. Pay them the same. Why can't they be officers? Number two, when they're caught by the Confederates, they're being butchered. That's got to stop. Why do they have different rules than your rules? Why don't we? He's like, Frederick, we're going to get there. We're going to do it. They have images of the war. What's going to happen after the war? He said, first things first, I got to get reelected.
If you're just tuning in, this guy has been on Fox and Friends for how many years now?
25. Radio show for 13.
Well, hold on a second. Did you just say 25?
Yeah. I started filling in 96.
You were in junior high school?
I thought so, yeah. It was crazy.
You were playing Pop Warner football and they grabbed you?
It took me 12 years to get to Fox. And then once I got there, I realized how great it was, even though no one had heard of it yet. So when it started, I started filling in as a sports guy. And then it evolved, and things started going crazy from the war, from the election mess to the war on terror to the Iraq war.
You mean the first election mess?
2000.
Chad hanging Chads.
Yes.
So you are the youngest living institution in the country. That's pretty, seriously, that's amazing, 25 years from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I knew when I walked into that place it was going to be special. They were all about winning. They were all about substance. They were all about getting things done, completion-oriented. Every time there would be a negative story out, they would put their headline on the wall. I'm like, wow, they're not running for negative stories. They would laugh at being laughed at. I go, these guys, this is like Bill Parcells and the Giants before they were even 500. Until recently. I'm talking about the Bill Parcells Giants.
I honestly cannot believe 25 years. Good for you. Well, okay, but you've been writing books, and the new one is about Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, the president and the freedom fighter. I always want to ask people, where did you get the idea to write a book about Lincoln and Frederick Douglass? I mean, I know they knew each other, but talk about the idea behind this.
I said, all right, the Civil War. What could I do that's not plowed ground, from Ken Burns' series to the remarkable book David Blight wrote about Frederick Douglass, got, I think, Book of the Year 5 years ago. And then what about Lincoln? Literally, you and I have the same situation. We get books about Lincoln to our desks all the time, and they're all great. I'm waiting for a bad one.
Nobody who's been written about more. There's like maybe 3 people who've written about, like, Napoleon, Jesus, Lincoln. I mean, I don't know how many books have been written about Lincoln. So yeah, what do you do for a fresh angle on the Civil War?
So what I wanted to do is also, I didn't mind tackling race, but I wanted to do it through quotes, not opinion. So I said, what if I talk about their parallel lives to the degree in which they read a lot of the same books, that they overcame incredible obstacles, nothing like Frederick Douglass. I get it. Guy was enslaved until he was at 20 years old, 2 tries, got out in the second time. Within 7 years has a biography. It's a bestseller, and then starts a world tour and becomes famous in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and England. This guy was a slave 10 years before, but decides to come back to America because there's 4 million enslaved, 350,000 slave owners, and he sees potential in this guy Lincoln and the Republican Party that we're finally ready to do something.
Now, look, I didn't know this. People are always amazed at what I don't know. I don't know almost everything. And when I hear something like this, I say, wow, I did not know that Frederick Douglass was thinking this way and that he saw something in Lincoln. What year was it that he kind of notices Lincoln? I
think he notices him in the 50s, and he gets to really see him and read about him in this Lincoln-Douglas debates. Yeah. And what I was fascinated, Eric, is we're broadcasters, and everything changed in broadcasting since we got in. It used to be the network news and cable. Nobody wants cable. Now cable is streaming, and then who knows, everyone's got a show on a network. But back then it was give a speech, make sure that speech gets in every newspaper. So the Cooper Union speech and the Douglas debates, yeah, they had big crowds, but it was the transcription of the debates that made them famous.
Suddenly this is the whole country is able to read what he said.
And he knew it. And even though he was born to 2 illiterate parents and his mom dies at 9 years old and he's living in a rural agricultural life, physically he's a specimen, and he has no push to get educated. But another theme about today's news that makes it easy to talk about it on Fox is that education is what we're talking about. Race is what we're talking about. History is what we're talking about. Our heritage is what we're talking about. So Lincoln says, I'm going to matter. And he would take long trips just to pick up a book, as you know, and then he would sit there and talk and interact with people intellectually, while at the same time, physically, he was working the land with a dad that said, put down the books. We don't want any more learning. You got to work for a living. But he had a mom and a stepmom that's pushed him towards that direction. Becomes a lawyer, gets out on his own, determined to matter, starts running for office, has some success. If you want to study Lincoln, every speech is written except for the law speech, which they found a transcript of the law speech. So even that's there. You see how this man evolves and how he thinks. And to fast forward quick, Douglas has a newspaper. So what made this interesting to study is I read Douglas's North Star, and you could read what he said in The Liberator under William Lloyd Garrison. And it's not Brian Kilmeade interpreted, no. Read his words,
right.
And I'll put the quotes in. Read what he said, and don't tell me any different. Now, Lincoln says some stuff that we'll find racially more than insensitive. I believe everyone should have liberty. I believe slavery is wrong, but I don't think blacks and whites are equal. Really? Well, he's a person of his times. He would evolve. By the time he's done, Frederick Douglass, the minute he sees him, all those statements that made his hair curl would melt away when he saw this man who's sitting there in the White House when he goes to see him, too big for his chair, sprawled out in a rumpled suit, and all he saw was honesty and integrity. And they engaged in a conversation, and he realized he was dealing with a great man and that they could work together.
So they didn't actually meet until Lincoln was president.
Till Lincoln's president. And Lincoln never wrote about Douglas, but everybody was aware of Douglas, one of the most famous men in the world.
Yeah, no question about it. So Douglas was, you call him a freedom fighter because the title of the book is The President and the Freedom Fighter. So what did he think of as his role during the war? Because obviously they were friends during the war. They didn't meet before the war. What did he feel that he was able to do? Was he one of those encouraging Lincoln to write the Emancipation Proclamation, for example?
Yes. I love that question. So what he thought for the war is, it's like saying, hey, I'd like to give you a gift, and then them saying, I want more. I want one bigger, and I want it faster. So he's saying, okay, you said the slave states can't exist, two countries can't exist. You watched 7 states leave before you got there. You got literally no votes in the South. 40% of the country voted for him. The rest didn't. Stephen Douglas was supposed to win, but the Democratic vote got divided. And this one-time congressman becomes president. Obviously, the perfect man at the perfect time. But this is what drove Douglas crazy. So the first thing he says is, I need the 7 states back. So I got to do an inaugural. And to get them back, I am going to say, hey, guys, keep your slaves. I'll make it the 13th Amendment. You can keep your slaves. We just got to get the country back together. Now, Douglas feels like he's been deceived.
Yeah.
How are you kidding me? What are you talking about? With acquiescing to this type of behavior? You know it's unacceptable. You ran that it's unacceptable, although he was never an abolitionist. You knew it was unacceptable, but you do it. And then later, to fast forward, when it's time to dedicate the statue after Lincoln's assassination 10 years later with a statue that was raised by freed slaves for him, it is Douglas that's asked to give the speech, not the sitting president Ulysses S. Grant. In that speech, he talked about what I just said, but he also said, with being as a statesman, he was not slow. He was quick, he was direct, and he was driven to freeing the slaves because he had a country to keep together. He didn't have a mission. He had a country was his mission.
This is the trick. This is what it is to be a leader, and it's amazing. Okay, you say that these two figures, even though they interacted dramatically over the years, they only actually met in person 3 times.
Supposed to be 4, but evidently Douglas had a speech, couldn't make it. So we did a show, an hour show. Fox was kind enough to put it on 10 o'clock on November 7th, and it's now on Fox Nation. So over the last 4 months, it was tough with the pandemic because a lot of people, everything's closed. But I went to Rochester, went to Indiana, where Lincoln spent the bulk of his childhood. Obviously went to Washington. One of the places I went to is the White House, where Frederick Douglass decided, I am going to meet Abraham Lincoln. We're at the point in the war where the South was doing extremely well. And it was at the point in the war where Lincoln couldn't afford anymore to pretend as if we didn't need African Americans to fight for their own freedom. And he said, Seward said, been pushing him to do it, Secretary of State. He said, Mr. President, don't do it now. Do it after a big win. And Antietam, as bloody as it was a win. And Douglas knows, and he goes to visit him, and he's about to do it, and he let African Americans are fighting, and they formed the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which is famous and depicted in Glory.
The movie Glory, great
and by the way,
movie.
you know who fought in there? two of Douglas's sons. So he wasn't asking while he recruits. He is not asking anyone to do what his sons aren't doing. Both his sons in that unit, one got wounded. So he goes to see Lincoln, and he doesn't know Lincoln. He knows he's been critical of Lincoln. So they say, go down there. He sees the Secretary of War. It went well. He said, listen, if you can recruit for me, I'd love it. And if you want to be an officer, I'll do it. And he puts a form out and he goes, I want to make this guy an officer. He goes, I'm going to go see the president now. He goes, good. Tell him we met. So he lines up. So Eric, you could line up outside the White House in the middle of the Civil War with the enemy 20 miles away with no guards, and you wait. So you wait. He waited all of 5 minutes. They go, excuse me, sir, what do you want to do? I'm Frederick Douglass. You have a card. Here's your card. 5 minutes. He sends for Douglass. He walks past sitting congressmen. He walks past the richest people in the world, sitting senators, and he goes, Frederick Douglass. And as soon as he looked across the way, he saw all the problems he had with Lincoln melt away. Not that he was in awe of him. He said there was something pure about him. And one of the things, if I could paraphrase, he says, I realized I was looking at a man that truly embodied the phrase, honest Abe. And they sit there and talk, but not platitudes. They talk in substance. And he says, listen, you got your black fighters, but you're not paying them the same. Pay them the same. Why can't they be officers? Number two, when they're caught by the Confederates, they're being butchered. That's got to stop. Why do they have different rules than your rules? Why don't we? He's like, Frederick, we're going to get there. We're going to do it. They have images of the war. What's going to happen after the war? He said, first things first, I got to get reelected. If I don't get reelected, there's not another candidate that wants to finish this war. They just want to have a peace treaty. He's got it. So he understood, I can't do what Douglas wants if I alienate the rest of the North who might see things differently.
This is agony. I mean, leadership of this kind and being a father can be this way. It's agony when you think that you have to make this decision knowing that it's going to be that people are going to suffer, but it's the best decision. But you can't do it flippantly like, hey, I mean, it aided him. You get that impression that he had a real soul